Today, we live in a shameless society. The reason for this? Sin is no longer discussed in churches. People are less religious and they're unwilling to discuss sin because they're afraid of making people upset and losing people to their church because sin isn't a pleasant word. And so what has happened is sin is now considered to simply be a crime. But sin and crime are not the same thing. Sin is a violation of God's law. Crime is a violation of human law. A crime might be a sin, but a sin is not necessarily a crime. Problem here is that crime in our society is often thought of as no one's fault. We can all think of an example when someone has stolen something. And everyone says, well, it wasn't really their fault. It was the way they were brought up. They didn't know any better. We make excuses so that crime is just a symptom of our society rather than an action that someone needs to take responsibility for. And if we don't take responsibility, we don't feel shame, because shame is what we feel when we take responsibility for our actions. And if no one takes responsibility, shame will not exist. But shame is an important concept in the Bible. The word shame or ashamed occurs 181 times. 149 occurrences are in the Old Testament and 32 are in the New Testament. And the word translated shame or ashamed really have four meanings. First, there is this idea of the exposure of our sin when confronted with God. It's how we feel when God sees the level of our sin. In the symbolic story of Adam and Eve, Genesis says the man and his wife were both naked before God and felt no shame. Well, they were naked and exposed before God, but they felt no shame because this was prior to sin. The second meaning is disgrace or extreme humiliation. Daniel talks about this. Multitudes who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake, some to everlasting life, others to shame and everlasting contempt. And so it is this disgrace. So rather than elevation, it is the opposite of that. Shame can also mean disappointment, being let down. Paul writes, I am not ashamed of the Gospels. Paul doesn't mean that he's not embarrassed by the Gospels. What he means is the gospel will not let me down. I will not be let down by the Gospels. And the last meaning is speechless. Ezekiel writes of those who have done evil being left speechless. You will remember and be ashamed and never again open your mouth because of your humiliation. In Romans 10, though, Paul gives us good news. He says, anyone who trusts in Christ will never be put to shame. This means anyone who trusts in Christ will be saved, will not feel shame when standing before God, will not feel disgraced, will not feel disappointment, and will not be left speechless. And the other wonderful good news from these words of Paul is that this promise is for everyone.